Hello and welcome to the latest Science of Sport podcast. I'm your host Matt Solomon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Usher. So Andrew is a researcher and a sports scientist, and his expertise is in muscle oxygenation in professional boxing. So we're here today to discuss how you can improve muscle performance in professional fighting. So without further ado, it's time to welcome Andrew onto the show. So Andrew, welcome to the Science of Sport podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So can you give us a quick introduction as to who you are and what you've been up to until now?
Yep, so I am an exercise physiologist and teaching fellow at Abertay University, where we do a mix of applied science and work with a mixture of athletes ranging from early start careers right through to elites. My own consultancy business is probably combat sports heavy. My background, being a bit of a dinosaur, is fought Muay Thai as a kid and worked a lot with kind of a mixture of boxing and MMA athletes. And all my PhD research was centered around looking at the underlying physiology and muscle oxygen kinetics in professional boxing.
So that's obviously something that we're going to touch on today with some energy systems bits and pieces. So like when we're talking about fighting specifically, can you give us the importance of conditioning or energy systems, or the oxygenation of muscles? Why is that important for combat athletes?
So obviously, it also depends obviously whether you're doing an amateur and you're doing 3-3s versus say a pro that's doing maybe 4 rounds or right through to 12, or an MMA fighter doing 5 minutes. But conditioning is effectively obviously your engine. So the way we kind of sum up to athletes is we're in the business of developing and building chassis and engines. And we're very good at building chassis in the world of strength. We're very good at building strength. But in the world of the conditioning, the chassis, we're probably not as good. And I think that's fundamental because our understanding of energy systems and probably the physiology is somewhat lacking at times. So what you tend to see is an athlete will have the strength to hold an opponent, to clinch an opponent, to kick, but you'll hear the constant things between rounds. My legs are giving way. I don't feel I can push as hard. And that's all basically comes down to the conditioning side. So in order to survive and take the punishment that an athlete takes, they need to have a well-tuned engine and a good sense of conditioning. And that's super important. I mean, it doesn't really matter the sport. I think conditioning is probably overlooked a lot generally. But in the research that we did, we wanted to make it clear that there's a difference between systemic understanding, like your VO2 max or kind of aerobic testing, and versus your peripherals, what the muscle actually does in the sport. Now, given the muscle is the king, because at the end of the day, we don't have a locomotor without muscle contraction and calcium sensitivity, et cetera, then it's important that we understand that we have to train the peripheral system as well as the aerobic system. And there is a slight disconnect in how blood flow gets to muscle tissue. So my argument has been for a long, long time is that we need to have a better understanding of what is the conditioning needs of the athlete and how do we put something in place in order to kind of allow that adaptation to take place.
And I want to touch on that in just a second, but when we look at how these kind of things are traditionally trained, what are fighters doing? I mean, you can see like the Rocky montage and you're like, oh, right, yeah, running on the beach and all that kind of stuff and frolicking. But what's happening traditionally to get some kind of conditioning stimulus?
So a lot of times you're seeing just the classic mid-ball slams, hat and sledge stuff. You're seeing some bike sprints, and obviously we're very sprint heavy, but there's no real assessment of where is that individual's conditioning, and often there's no real understanding from the coach about what type of adaptation are you trying to get. So you'll often see people saying we're doing alactic conditioning because we want to improve the alactic system, and that's kind of like a bit of a misnomer for a start. And one of the reasons for that is they may be doing a 6-second sprint, but then they may be subsequently doing another 6-second sprint, and when you look at the program, they may be doing 10 6-seconds. But by the time you get to that third sprint, you're predominantly anaerobic glycolytic in your work, and you're predominantly oxidative phosphorylation as you drive forward. So realistically, they're not training anything lactic for that brief, small period of time. And there seems to be a heavy prevalence on this whole idea that we want to train the alactic system. We want to go anaerobic. But actually, boxing is an aerobic-based sport. So one of the interesting things that obviously I had thought for a lot of years, and we found it in the research, was that when it comes to the peripheral system and the muscle, once the muscle initially engages in a round, it attempts to move into a steady state, which makes sense because it's efficiency, right? So it moves into this kind of more steady state. And it's only when the boxer stops at the end of the round do you see the muscle actually wants to try and regain some kind of oxygen. So these sports are highly aerobic. But again, a lot of people are training these alactic systems and doing a lot of long, steady state running, thinking that they're obviously getting enough, I hate to use it, but I will use it, zone 2 type work for cardiac output. But the thing is that most athletes, when they're on the pads doing technical sessions or they're doing bag work, are probably in zone 2 anyway. Most of them are not pushing it as hard as they need to push. So there's probably enough left ventricle development over a boxer's career. But what there isn't is the understanding that well-trained athletes need to have a higher level of stimulus for adaptations. So there's not enough planning around that takes place. But it is a bit like the Rocky montage. And a lot of places, people jumping over, feel like the bunny hop over bars. And there's just, if you think about the sport and you think about the demands of the sport, sparring is close to the kind of competition. So it's probably I always say that sparring is the best expression of the sport that you can get. But people aren't training conditioning for that, which I always find quite strange. So I'm like, well, obviously, ultimately, our aim is to get the athlete prepared to go in to compete. So we should be planning our conditioning around the expression of the sport, not necessarily, because they can do a 10-miler in X amount of minutes. So it is quite strange. Boxing it is getting better. I think it's still getting better on the strength side. I don't think it's getting better on the conditioning side because I still think strength conditioning is very big S, small c. And for me, it should be kind of the opposite way around. But most coaches are still heavy big on the strength side. They think that strength is more important. And I'd argue that's probably less important than you probably think in a sport like boxing. If you think about delivery mechanisms, glenohumeral joint, rotation of the wrist and all that type of stuff, then I think strength is probably overtrained and conditioning less trained.
And when it comes to the optimization of conditioning training, so you mentioned like zone 2 work, it's important. It's an aerobic based sport, but when we're going to make the real difference, what kind of physiology is going on? Because you mentioned also things like oxygen delivery to the muscle. What kind of physiology is underpinning the adaptations which you need as a boxer, for example, fight sport?
So we would argue that mitochondrial adaptation is probably fundamentally the most important thing you can get. And so when we do sprints now, we just do sprints. We don't call them alactic, kind of glycolytic, etc. Because if anyone looks at the work of Michelle Parolin or looks at Bibas, McInnes, Hargreaves, and Spreet, these are really good papers that will show you how energy systems and substrate intensity is driven. Well, substrates is driven by intensity, and these are really good, beautiful papers that show you that when you engage in a sprint, the contribution levels and how those contributions differ as the sprint occurs. And the reason that occurs is obviously mitochondrial adaptation and kind of mitochondrial activation. So what we're interested in doing is increasing mitochondrial biogenesis. Because obviously we know that kind of mitochondria is important for kind of ATP, so for adenosine triphosphate production, and obviously responsible for oxidative phosphorylation. So sprints allow you a small window of time with high intensity that can develop that over longer run states or longer steady states. So my argument has always really been that in the world of combat sports, boxers need to be able to box. That's first and foremost for me, is a boxer needs to be able to box. Everything else is just icing on the cake. So I would rather an athlete be spending technical time than spending long time out on the road. I have nothing against running. People think I have big issues running, but I don't, because I'm a lot of ultra runners. For me, it's always about time and investment. You know yourself, it's like you have X amount of time with an athlete. How are you going to spend that time? And for me, we can get the same adaptations, if not better, in sprint sessions or targeted bag sessions than we can 10 them out on the road. And in that road time, we can bring it back and use it for technical training. So it could be technical sparring. It could be much more kind of pad work, looking at much more kind of maybe tactical awareness, whatever. It could be any of that stuff. So that's kind of my big thing. But the underlying principle of sprint training really is that whole idea of developing mitochondria. That's the whole thing. And what we have found in the paper that's in peer review just now is that 3 weeks of sprint interval training has a massive effect on mitochondrial rate and function. So we did this occlusion protocol where we took the athletes in, we put a blood pressure cuff on the upper thigh, we crammed it all the way up to over 300 mercury, did some rapid inflations on it. And whilst we had the infrared spectroscopy monitor on it, the MOXIE monitor, and you can see how the muscle desaturates and then recovers. Took the cuff off, made them do an incremental treadmill test of volition, so that we want to make sure they were truly fatigued, because most of the research isn't like that. Once they were truly fatigued, those poor kids get dragged off the treadmill, slapped back on the table, blood pressure cuff was on, and we did a series of rapid occlusions. And what we found was that after 3 weeks of sprint interval training, the rate in which mitochondria was recovering was much, much quicker. It was like 160%. It was dramatically much, much more. And it modeled the old McCulley work back in the day when he looked at the same idea of PCR utilization and biopsies from the muscle tissue. So we found that we had the same mono-exponential fit and the same recovery 3 weeks post, which they had on biopsies. So we had a very strong correlation that sprints are actually increasing kind of mitochondrial functional rate. Now, the caveat to it is we're not doing biopsies. So, we're not actually looking directly in the muscle tissue and looking at kind of tissue samples, but there's enough evidence using the infrared spectroscopy and stuff and the research to show that there's a strong correlation. So that's the real driving reason behind why we do sprints. But we would do other things as well if we needed to do it. But going back to systemic for a little second, because I'm rambling. But aerobic capacity, we know what aerobic capacity is in boxing. We have from 1995 with Asif Ghosh when he did the first paper looking at heart rate to lactate, to Phil Davis, to Mitch Finley's latest systematic review. We know the boxers range from roughly about 44 milliliters per kilogram per minute, right up to probably 63, 64. It's not massive. Probably most fall in the 50 mark. So if you think about that's not a particularly high aerobic capacity for an elite athlete, but it's enough. So if that's not the limiting factor, then something else has to be the limiting factor for performance. And what we have found is the ability for the body to take that blood flow through the capillary bed, through the slope exchange gradient, into the muscle tissue and utilize it. Better working muscle means much better extraction rate and much better recovery rate. Poorer muscle means slower. And that's the basic. It's pretty basic stuff, actually. We're not doing anything like nothing new. It's been around for a long, long time. We're probably just conceptualizing it slightly different to everyone else.
And I am rudely interrupting to make sure you're up to date and aware of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. And the Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you're enjoying today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes so you can get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. So hit that link in just a few minutes when the podcast is finished.
And what's then the difference between using sprints to improve mitochondrial biogenesis compared to aerobic? Because, obviously, I think most sports scientists will be there like, well, aerobic adaptations, mitochondria, we'll get that. Why is sprinting then different in that really short period of time?
So what sprinting's giving you is the muscle has to extract oxygen much quicker. So if you hit a sprint, for example, a walk back's a good example, load bike. So you do a sprint and what happens is, say you're doing like a Wingate, so you're 30 seconds on, 60 off. So you hit that sprint all out, and the time it takes you to reach your peak kind of sprint power is roughly where your PCR depletion is taking place. Okay, obviously other substrates are involved, but that's, if you want to kind of simplify it, that's it. And then after that, you see then you can move into kind of anaerobic glycolytic function and then oxidative phosphorylation. So what sprints are doing are creating a heavy stimulus load that's requiring a high level of mitochondrial kind of activity straight off the bat. When the muscle contracts, because the intensity level, the body's like, whoa, we need to supply oxygen here. And what you get is this linear slope, which is your extraction rate. And then when you relax, it comes back. So sprints give you that in a really fast kind of method with high intensity, but the intensity is critical. Now, most people when they do sprints are probably not doing sprints the way we would be asking them to do sprints. So we tend to use the word supramaximal because it has to be completely all out, because you're trying to generate that amount of oxygen extraction in order to elicit the adaptation. General low-level aerobic work gets there by much, much longer adaptation over time. So the muscle is not being put under as much pressure, and it takes a lot longer to get the adaptations. Whereas the sprint, you can be in and out. So we often say 60 seconds of work's enough 3 times a week, and people go, whoa, that doesn't seem like a lot. However, on the flip side, people will then go, I can't have an athlete do 60 seconds of supramaximal per week, I'll kill them. So on one hand, we get told it's not enough time, and the other hand, we go, it's too intense, which is kind of always kind of interesting because the kickback often we get is, my God, that's a heavy training load. And you're like, well, it's not really from a physiological perspective. It's a rapid onset. It's like I say to people, if you were in a sudden car accident or something, you wouldn't really care about energy system works. Adrenaline's going to kick in, hormones are going to kick in, and you're going to fly out that door and get to the scene of the accident in a supermaximal capacity. People can do it. So the upshot is sprints will give it to you much quicker, but it has to be because the intensity has to drive the substrate utilization, whereas lower aerobic zones are going to give you that mitochondrial adaptation, but you're going to spend maybe like 2 hours, 3 hours of your life per week to obtain it. And our take is that most athletes do enough of that per week through technical training, skills training. So probably getting enough of that level of stimulation, but not enough to take it to another level. And this is why we need a bit more high intensity to drive the adaptations. It's like anything, isn't it? Like, you strength phases, you plateau out at points. And and the other thing is if you don't use mitochondria, you lose it. So it's not like you don't keep it, you have to use it, you lose it. That's the other thing I think a lot of people don't really understand is it's a use or lose system. So if you're not creating mitochondrial biogenesis, it's not going to hang around because it doesn't need it. So I think people think they do mitochondrial work that it's in the bank, we've got an extra 2,000 cells, it's going to be there. It's not, it will dissipate. So you have to kind of constantly be looking at training stimulus in order to create the change, which is why the other important thing with sprint training is that it has to be periodized in a way where intensity is being monitored and intensity is being changed periodically to create the adaptations. And that's the tricky part of it in some ways.
And how do you get that intensity, right? So you said like super maximal, for example, but let's say you've got a watt bike and you're sat on there and you can just crank up the gears and you go maximally for your 6 or 10 seconds, whatever. How do you ensure that is intense enough?
Ideally, you come to the lab and you experience vomiting out the back door. So for clients that I work with that are remote, because we work with a lot of remote clients, we basically just make sure that if they're using like something like a watt bike, that we can get the data. If it's like a concept rower, because we got a lot of kids that don't have any money, so they're using assault bikes. So there's kind of different ways of doing it. First one's heart rate. You basically monitor the heart rate to make sure you're getting a nice peak maximal heart rate. And this is where we tend to look at systemic recovery. So basically we will plot heart rate over a long period of time. What we do is we measure the on-kinetics, so the time it takes to peak, and it's called a mono-exponential curve fit. So basically how we do it is we look at slow and fast phases, how quick can they get to the max heart rate, and then we analyze the heart rate on the other side, the off-kinetics, to see how it models and is it fit in good recovery. And what we're interested there is when is the fast phase of recovery? Is the fast phase kicking in early or is it late? And does that need shift? So that's one way we measure the intensity if they don't have able to get data. If they can give us the watt bike data, then we're looking at the time to peak power. How long is the peak power being held? What's the decay ratio? And that will give us some nice info. Couple that with the heart rate, you get quite a nice picture, and you can see that over time. And then the golds would be somebody on a bike with data, with a Moxie sensor or a Portamon. Nobody's got a Portamon because those things are bloody expensive. But even like a Moxie device, and then we get a full picture of power being produced to external metric, internal via RPM, heart rate, and muscle, and we can get a whole picture, and then we can tell. Interestingly, on intensity levels, when we did the research paper looking at sprint interval training, one of the interesting things about that was because we were using this method to measure intensity remotely. Because what I was interested in was, we're going to make these kids do sprints and have a look at mitochondrial change, but I don't want it in a laboratory setting. I want to send them to their own gym with their own kit. I don't care whether it's a spin bike, an assault bike. If the research holds true, and my supervisor at the time, John Babry's 10 years of sprint training holds true, then we should see an adaptation after 3 weeks. Okay, because as we've discussed this, applied science is completely different to being in the lab. So the interesting thing was, we did get the adaptations, but you could tell one athlete wasn't pushing nearly as super maximally as the rest. And I shall not mention who that was, but he knows. Well, you could see it, but he still had adaptation. So it wasn't like he wasn't pushing hard enough, but compared to everyone else, you could tell it wasn't a super maximal effort. So he didn't try and kill himself on the bike. So you could see it. So it was definitely there. And with remote clients, we can see it. So what we'll do is per week. So our protocols are pretty easy. We ask for 3 sprints a week. Now, the beautiful thing about sprint training is it can be anytime. So Gary Hutt at GB Boxing took the idea and he has them do it, say, after a bag session. So you can do it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You can do it Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Your body doesn't care when you do it as long as you do it. The only time we don't do it would be before games or before sparring, and we would do sprints. But the beautiful thing about these 60 seconds sessions that we build is you can slap them on anywhere. So that you could come in the morning, do them first thing in the morning. Some athletes do it before they go to bed. They're really, really super kind of flexible, which is really, really good. But the intensity is the key. So you can chart it in lots of different ways. And heart rate is probably the easiest for coaches that don't have a lot of knowledge in scripting tools or programming or spreadsheets. You can look at it. The heart rate kinetics is probably something nobody is doing that's probably more important than people realize. For example, if you have an athlete and say they get to the maximum heart rate, say 190, and they're dropping, say, 40 beats in 60 seconds, there's a tendency for someone to go, wow, that's really good, I'm getting cool. But sometimes when you actually look at that 60 seconds, you can see that actually the fast phase of recovery or the better recovery isn't occurring to the last component of the 60 seconds. For a combat athlete, that's quite dangerous territory because it's shown that recovery is actually still quite delayed. And then what you can see is with an athlete that's maybe not recovering as well, although it looks like they are, is that subsequent rounds, that fast phase is drifting and you're starting to get cardiac drift. And I'm surprised that a lot more people, especially in combat sports, are not switching on to this, that the quality of the recovery is often more important than the recovery itself. Because we've had athletes that may have slightly less beats compared to someone else, but the fast phase is really quick. So as soon as they come to the corner bump, the heart's starting to move into nice flow recovery. And it's the same with oxygen kinetics. The same idea that you want to have good immediate response. You don't want delayed slow response. So kinetics is very crucial to everything that we do. It plays a big part in everything, including sprints, power, everything. Kinetics is the key.
And when an athlete does have the slower kinetic or fast phases later,
yep,
what can you do to improve that?
So this is when you get into kind of how do you periodize your sprints. So if you want heart rate recovery, you shorten the interval of recovery. If you wanted to delay recover a little bit, say for example, we have an athlete like heavyweight, obviously they're not going to kill it as much as the bantamweight is in the super maximal sprints because they're going to die much quicker. So if we want a heavyweight to have a bit more power in a shot, maybe get a track athlete with a shot put or whatever, what we'll do is we'll have a 6 second on and then we'll maybe give them 24 to 30 seconds off to recover. And then we'll start to look at their kinetics. And then over time, we will then bring it closer. So we'll start going 6 on, 18, 6 on, 12, whatever. But it's the key sprint training isn't just the sprints. It's kind of actually how the body's really replying to it. Because if the Sunday comes and we kind of look at it and we go, this athlete's been doing really, really well in sprints, and then all of a sudden that fast phase is pushing further to the right, then we'll go back to pushing it to the left by shortening the recovery down. So it is a very individualized thing. And this is probably the other big mistake that people make, is they do not individualize the sprints to the individual physiological response. But it's just a case of, that's the easy thing with sprints. It's like a ratio. So you go 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 3. It's like Wingate's 30 on, 60 off. They just found a really golden setup. And that's the test that we do with everyone. So even if a new athlete comes in that's remote, I'll ask them if they've got a watt bike, if they've got an assault bike. The first thing I'll get them to do is to give me 2 weeks of 30 on, 60 off twice for 3 times a week. That's the baseline. Because one of the beautiful things about the Wingate is those 30 seconds is enough time to look at how the heart rate is actually coming up, and it's enough recovery time to see how it's coming down, and it ties really nice to boxing or any combat sport with a 60-second recovery interval.
Absolutely excellent. So when it comes to bringing this all together, what does a conditioning session with you look like? I know you're probably going to talk us through the first stage where you actually need to assess it, but what do you do then? Athlete comes to you and they're like, right, I need to improve my fitness. What is that process, and what does then the conditioning training potentially look like?
So we obviously, if we can get to the lab, we'll do a full lab session, which is a whole heap of things. If we can't, we'll get them to do the 2 Wingates remotely. And then what I'll ask them to do is I'll always ask them to get a heart rate monitor. If they don't have a heart rate monitor, we'll either provide it or we'll get a sponsor to provide it. Because what I want to do is track all their training sessions. So, and I do this for two reasons. One is I want to have a look at training load. I want to just look at what the training load looks like. And I want to look at how do they recover between play as well. Because I think sometimes we can get very lost in S&C, that we get focused in on the strength conditioning, but we don't really pay enough attention about how that's translating across the performance and whether our program is having any detriment to performance or whether we're getting some benefits. So I'll capture all of that data. And then after the first 2 weeks of baseline, based on what I will see, especially for combat sports, if we use boxers, for example, I will periodize bag sessions. So I will target intervals on the bag session. So rather than self-autonomously just hitting it for the sake of hitting it, which is what happens, beep goes beep, 3 minutes in the bag, beep, move to a different bag. We will just be like, no, I want you to do 10 on, 20 off for the duration of the round. The second round, I want you to maybe 20 on, 10 off, whatever. I will plan that because I'm then sneakily getting in a little bit more interval-based training. And then we'll give them their 3 sprint sessions per week that they will do. And I will ask them for a fast run time. So I'll ask them to give me, in the beginning, like a fast 5K time. And because we've got a lot of GB athlete data from different sports, I can benchmark my athletes. So for example, all of our athletes that have been with us for a few months, you start to see their 5K run time comes between 17 and 19 minutes. So we get, because I'm not interested in long runs, I'm looking for adaptations. And a 5K, when you're relatively fit, is like a long sprint. It's like a sprint. And I also use the Monday morning sprint as a screening tool for training load. So if that kid suddenly is hitting 22 minutes, I'll be on the phone to them by 12 o'clock, ask them what did he do at the weekend, because I might not want to push his sprints as heavy if there's something's occurred or he goes, oh, I'm a bit fluey, or the heavy sparring weekend or whatever. I will modify it. But it's a very simple process. It's a bag session. It will then be targeted 3 bike sprints. It'll be runs. If we have athletes that can't run, we'll do rowing, which they hate with a vengeance. Nobody likes the concept of a rower, especially boxers. We'll do that. And then we'll always have an S&C. We'll have an S block as well. So we'll have a strength block. So for us, the strength block tends to be a lot of single leg work. We tend to find boxers are particularly asymmetrical. Not that that's an issue, because there's asymmetry in boxing, and especially oxygen use. But we do a lot of Bulgarian split squats. We do a lot of type of stuff and try and strengthen legs up, because we know obviously power's coming from the legs mainly. So we will do that as well. And that's it. And it's a rinse and repeat. I've had athletes for 4 years doing sprints every week of the year. So no one likes it because it is awful. But everyone will tell you that the adaptations are there. And that's it. And it's just, what will happen is your sprints will never probably be the same each week unless you're incredibly fit and good adaptations. And then we'll periodically try and get everyone into the lab if we can. Because you do want to get, as much as I'm not a massive lover of VO2 max with oxygen data is very, very useful. So we'll try and get that. Occasionally I will send people to private labs to try and get the data. The problem I've got with private labs is just getting someone that's got all the Moxie stuff as well. And that's it. It's a very simple process. I mean, we're not doing anything that crazy, actually. Which surprises me that people think we are, because it's actually quite mundane, to be perfectly fair. It's quite, but yeah. And sparring. So the one thing I will say is sparring. So any combat athlete, we're very religious in getting sparring data. That's thing, because at the end of the day, if all the conditioning isn't seeing a better performance, so they're not recovering better between rounds, or they're not performing better within the rounds, then something's not right. One of the big things we are massive on is accountability. That's a big thing for us. So we like all the teams to be involved. It doesn't happen in combat sports that often, because ideally we'll have the S&C coach linked in with us, we'll have the nutritionist linked in with us, so we can say, right, how is this athlete moving during the week? Is everything okay? Is everyone happy with everything? And then ideally the boxing coach or striking coach can feed back and say, yeah, striking's looking good, able to throw more combinations, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't happen that often in boxing, though. I'll be brutally honest.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially because a lot of those people are funding themselves, or they're doing NGB programs, which may have like multiple athletes per one staff member. It's a little bit more divided up as such.
I mean, we're very lucky to get quite a good relationship with kind of Gary Hutton at GB Boxing. So, for example, we've got one kid that's on the academy program that, we do all of that kid's physical preparation on conditioning, but it all gets fed back into GB. So GB know exactly what sprints he's doing and stuff and that, and that's a really good system. And we have that with other NGBs as well, but professional boxing is not like that. No, at all. And there's a lot of ego. So, I mean, I'm a boxing coach myself, so I can understand when people are like, well, this university's come into play, or this individual's come into play, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, I don't really care about any of that. My excitement's for performance and an athlete winning things. I've had enough athletes through the years win things. I don't really care anymore, other than the pursuit of winning it is what really excites me. It's like every athlete's like its own little detective story. Why they do something, how did they do something, how did they respond to something, and that's what excites me and John. And me and John are bloody dinosaurs now, so we're getting on, but we still have this massive excitement over performance, and even watching the Olympics and watching kind of Noah Lyles and stuff. You're like, how he's squeezing that extra couple of seconds here. That's the stuff that drives us. So we are heavily focused on performance at Abertay University. That's one of the differences to our sports science, I think, to everywhere else is we do very good theoretical and physiology work, but we're very driven by winning stuff. We like to win shiny things.
Yeah. the magpies
The
of the
magpies,
university.
That's it, yeah. Shiny.
Absolutely excellent. Absolutely excellent stuff. So, Andrew, massive thanks for your time and effort today. It's been a pleasure talking.
No.
Where can people find a little bit more about you and what you're up to?
So I'm really awful on social, so I really need to work this out. So Twitter, Andrew Usher, Instagram, the Andrew Usher, and just the university's RKE research site will be on that. And yeah, so I'm trying to be a bit more positive in YouTube and post some small sports science snippets, etc. But it's just difficult time-wise. That's my excuse anyway.
Always. Matt, mate, massive thanks. It's been a pleasure talking. I look forward to speaking again soon.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks to Andrew for all of his hard work on today's podcast. I really appreciate it. I'm sure you do at home too. Before you leave, I want to point you in the direction of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. And the Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you enjoyed today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes. You can get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. What's more, every time you complete one of those courses, you'll get a certificate of completion which will prove your ongoing education. And if you have enjoyed today's podcast, it would be fantastic if you could recommend it to a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. That means that we can keep bringing best possible guests and the best possible content. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks from me. I'm Matt Solomon of Science of Sport, and I'll speak to you next week.